Hello, I'm Dennis Tucker, and I want to welcome you to another study of the book of Hebrews. We have been going through this book, and we have gotten to Hebrews 11th chapter. And this is one of the great chapters of all the Bible, and it is sometimes referred to as a chapter of faith, or the Hall of Fame of faith, or some other type of heroes of faith, are all used to describe this chapter, and fittingly so. And what we have really done is gotten to the part of Hebrews where he had made the points earlier. I've often said the Hebrews is kind of like a crochet. And as you look at something and you may see kind of a pattern there, and you may think, well, that really is an intricate pattern that the person has put together. But you have to keep in mind it's really one string. And that one string is simply woven together to make that whatever it is you're looking at. And so in Hebrews, we have some very simple ideas, but they're woven together. We have the fact that Jesus is Son of God. He came in the very image of God and revealed to us the will of God. He is the superior spokesman. And not only that, but also that he is our high priest. He's a faithful high priest. He is our superior high priest that we have today. And that he also has given us a superior law. And the covenant of Christ, the covenant God has given to us, is a superior covenant. And so, since these things are so, here's what we need to be doing. And as we had noticed in chapter 10, it tells us we should not shirk back, we should not forsake our obligations to one another, to God, but instead we need to come boldly to Him, and we need to continue to act with confidence in what God has promised us. And so, here in the 11th chapter, what we're dealing with is faith. And last week, what we studied in the first 8 verses of Hebrews 11th chapter is, first of all, kind of, I guess you call it a working definition of faith. It's not one as much as simply a belief system, but it is, he says, Hebrews 11, verse 1, now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. And that is that it is something that we have assurance of. Even though we haven't seen it yet, we know this is true. We know this for a fact. And then not only that, but also in verse 6, it says, without faith it is impossible to please God, because we must believe that He is, and that He is rewarded those who diligently seek Him. And so what we have then in the rest of this chapter really is in connection with those two ideas. And that is, we're given examples here of people who basically live by faith, that they are the examples that we need to emulate in our lives as far as what faith means to us. And so in the first lesson, we were dealing with 3 people primarily. We're dealing with Abel, and Abel offered a sacrifice by faith that was pleasing to God. We have also taught to us the idea of Noah, and Noah was one who built the ark, and that he's one that, again, listened to God and did what God said. And also we have Enoch. Enoch walked with God, and God took him. That Enoch's life was consistent with what God said to do. And one thing I'll point out in our class, and I know this is not the class setting, and quite frankly, I think class is a lot better because of the feedback we get from everybody. But in that class, let's point out these were not perfect people. That when we go through Hebrews, the 11th chapter, we're not talking about people that are examples of perfection, but they are examples of faith. These are people that sometimes did things wrong, but they do not continue on in their sins. They turn back to God, they believe in God, and they strive to please Him. They're just like us. And that we're not perfect individuals, but when we find out we're wrong, we make correction, and we continue to do what God says do. And so this section here deals with verses 8 through verse 22 of Hebrews 11th chapter. And as we've been doing in other classes, we're going to read the questions and then answer by the verses themselves. And so the first question is, what proves Abraham's complete trust in God when he went out? And this refers to the call, Genesis 11 chapter, when God tells Abraham to leave his homeland. And Hebrews 11 verse 8 says, by faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he would receive as an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going. And so this is significant in the sense that Noah's first person that is mentioned as being righteous in the Bible, that the actually phrase used to describe Noah. Abraham is the first person that is mentioned as being faithful, or living by faith, if you would, in Genesis 15, verse 6. And that is, he showed us faith because God said, leave your homeland, and I'm going to give you a land that you'll eventually see. And he did it. He simply went out, going to a land he did not know where he was going. And just like us, a lot of times we make decisions based on faith. We don't know where we're going, but we know we're going someplace. And then we have to make decisions based on faith. We believe what God said. We believe in the promises of God. And so we also have to sometimes just simply act by faith. God said this. I believe it. I'm going to do what God said to do. And that's what we see there in Abraham. And then verse 9, it said, by faith it dwelt in the land of promise as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents. And that is that when he left to go out there in this other land that God's going to show him, which turned out to be the land of Canaan, he went out to live in tents. And that word tent there is used tabernacle, actually. And you stop thinking about this. For 60 years, basically, Abraham went out there and lived as a foreigner, as a person not a part of the land, as a stranger land, but also living in tents, which showed his great faith in God. And then also the question is, what kind of a city do you look forward to? When you go on, it said that, for he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. Now here's the contrast here, and that is that he was looking for an enduring city. He's looking for a city that was permanent, not temporary. The tent has very little foundation. It is very temporary. But the city here has an unshakable foundation. The city that he wanted to go to, he said, whose builder and maker is God. Some translation says architect is God. And that's not a separation of the two. We may think of it as the builder and then you have the architect. But actually, the ideas are tied in together. The design and the builder of the city is God. And so that's where the kind of place he wanted to go to. And again, in our lives, we have to think about what is permanent, what is temporary. What is that which I can trust in? What is that which I desire? That which is temporary or that which is permanent? And it goes on and says, what is said about Sarah? Well, verse 11, and I have this in a 20th century translation for some reason. That's why I posted this in. But it says, again, it was faithful. It was faith that endured Sarah to conceive, though she was past the age for childbearing, because she felt sure that he had given her the promise would not fail. And that is, Sarah at first was skeptical. You have an occasion here in Genesis 18th chapter where she's told that she's going to have a child a year later, and she laughs. And the reason she laughs is because it's kind of out of derision, and maybe just kind of skepticism, because she's 90 years old. But yet, here in this passage, it says that she received the ability to conceive, that apparently she did believe God. And there's times we may not trust ourselves, but we do believe what God says. Sarah believed what God had promised them. And it goes on to say, how many descendants sprang from Abraham and Sarah? Verse 12, it says, therefore, for one man. Now we know he had Isaac and Jacob. And as you look through it, and through them had grandsons and had a great lineage. But in verse 12 it said, therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born as many as the stars of the sky in multitude, innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. So here we have this reference made here that as numerous as the star sky. You just think about how many stars are in the sky. Well, we can't actually number. We don't know how many there are. There's an infinite number, seems like, of stars in the sky. And so it's a number that we can't calculate. And then also, how many grains of sand on the seashore? There is a number there. I mean, there's a limit to how much grains are in the seashore, but we don't know. It's such a vast number we do not know. And so it's talking about that's going to be his lineage. And another question is this talking about his physical lineage or about his spiritual lineage? And we know that a great nation came from him. And that it was, again, many came from him through his son Jacob, and Isaac, and then Jacob, and then his children. But I think specifically this really reference to all those who be children of Abraham by faith, those who believe God and do what God said. Is this number that is cannot be calculated. Those who walk by faith is what he's referring to here. It said also, what did they not receive? talking about Abraham and Sarah. And what they did not receive, the 13th verse here in Hebrews 11 chapter says, these all died, not having received the promise. And that always referred to here is that Abraham, also Isaac, and Jacob received this land promise, received the promise of the land. And also, you look back and realize none of them actually received possession of that land itself. The Abraham did not receive the land. Isaac did not receive the land. He had a few descendants. Jacob, again, he wound up dying in Egypt. And so none of them actually received what had been promised. And so that's what they had not received. But then the next question is, what was their attitude to what they had not received? And in other words, you may think, well, would they have been disappointed? Would they have been fearful? Would they have doubted God? Would they have actually been angry at God for not giving them the land and the great promises He'd given to them? Well, again, verse 13, it said, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, were assured of them, embraced them, and confessed they were strange pilgrims on the earth. And that is because of their faith. And this is where it ties back into the first verse of this chapter, and 6th verse, that it is belief in what we have not seen, the assurance of things we have not seen, but yet we know that's going to happen. And so when God promised Abraham a great nation, the land of Canaan, and from his seed all nations should be blessed, although Abraham never saw those things himself right then, he knew they would happen. He knew exactly that God would keep his promise. And that's where you go in the New Testament. In the New Testament here in John 8, verse 56, Jesus says, your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and he saw it and was glad. And that is that Abraham knew God would send the seed, that through his seed all nations of the earth should be blessed, and he knew that would happen. And therefore, he saw that. To him, it was as real can be, although he was not literally there when Jesus was born. So that's what faith is. We understand what God says. We believe it to the point that we can see it in the future, if not in right now. What did they confess about their sojourn on earth? It's another next question. Well, it says in verse 13, last part of verse 13, confess they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. And talk about, for those who say such things, declare plainly they seek a homeland. And the word pilgrim here is stranger. Pilgrim means literally to be beside. It means to be kind of like parallel. Stranger, obviously, think about aliens. And what it says here is that while they lived here, they consider themselves being exiles here. They consider themselves being non-citizens, if you would, of the land of Canaan, but even of this world. And that in Genesis 23, verse 4, after Sarah had died, and they says, and I'm a foreigner and a visitor among you. Give me property for a burial place among you, that I may bury my dead out of my sight. After being in the land of Canaan for 60 years, Abraham still said, you know what, I'm still a stranger. I'm still a foreigner here. This is not my home. It reminds me of a number of years ago, the TV show Price is Right. Bob Barker was the host there, the MC. And I remember one time, they have people come down, the front there to call them to be contestants. And one guy came in, and Bob Barker all the time would ask the question, where are you from? And one guy came up, he was probably in his 50s, and maybe in his 60s. And the guy said, well, I'm from West Virginia. And Bob Barker said, oh, and he said, yeah. And then the guy said, now I've been living out here in California. So Bob Barker said, well, how long you been here? And he said, I've been here 40 years. And which Bob Barker said, no, you are a Californian. And that's the normal way we think about it. Okay, we live here a long time. We associate with where we're living in. But the fact is, we are pilgrims and strangers in this land, is what he's talking about. Abraham considered himself to be a sojourner here. And again, that's going to play a part in how we view life and how we make our decisions. Is this all there is? Is this what I'm hoping for? Or do I seek something better? The next question is, what are the implications of verse 15? And verse 15 says, and truly, if they had called to mind that country from which they had come out, they would have an opportunity to return. And that is that the road that brought Abraham out of Haran and out of Ur Chaldees flowed both ways. And you think about how tempting would have been at one time or another for Abraham to say, you know what, I'll go back home. I'll go back to Haran. I'll go back to Ur Chaldees. Think about what had they given up. The lifestyle that they had in that, the homeland, the fact of the absence of the relatives around them. All these things, and how tempting it is also for these Jewish people who had obeyed the gospel to think about going back to Judaism, going back to what they were comfortable with, going back to their friends, going back to their customs they were used to. Same thing about Christians. People who obey the gospel. And I remember when my parents obeyed the gospel, we were not church folks before that time period. I did not grow up going to Bible classes, learning all about the books of the Bible and about people like Abraham and Sarah. And whenever my parents obeyed the gospel, this was different. Sunday mornings was now no longer watching the NFL on television. It was no longer just doing whatever I wanted to, playing basketball. Now Sunday morning meant was going to go to church, we were going to go Bible class, and everything about it was just kind of uncomfortable. Well, to tell you the truth, now it's become comfortable because I've done it so long. But the fact is that a lot of times the newness of being a Christian and the temptation to go back to what you were comfortable with is very great. And so that's how can we relate to that. Now, Abraham, he could have gone back if he had wanted to. And just think about how tempted it is sometimes for Christians to go back into sin. But we don't because of faith. The next question is, why is God not ashamed to be called their God? In verse 16 says, but now they desire a better, that is a heavenly country. Therefore, he has prepared a city for them. God is not ashamed to be called their God, because they had faith, because they obeyed his word. They believed in what he said, and therefore God was not ashamed of them. In 2 Corinthians 5 verse 1 said, for we know that if our earthly house, this tent, is destroyed, we have a building for God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For in this we groan, earnestly desire to be clothed with our habitation which is from heaven. That we have to realize we're here for a temporary time. If we lived out our lives seeking that which is better, his city's foundation is God, the architect and builder is God. His city's foundation is unshakable. If we live that way, then God is not ashamed of us. It goes on and says, what did Abraham take into account when he offered up Isaac? And of course, this is one of the great chapters, one of the great events of faith in all the Bible. And that is, and when you go back and read about God telling Abraham, take Isaac, his only son, and sacrifice him on an altar. In Genesis 22nd chapter, go back and read that passage. And we see that Abraham had got to the point of actually laying Isaac on the altar and having the knife above his head, ready to come down and kill his son whenever God stopped him. And so Hebrews 11 verse 17 says, by faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, he who had received the promises, offered up his only begotten son, of whom he said, and Isaac your seed shall be called, concluding that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from which also he received him in a figurative sense. And that is, in one sense, there just really didn't make any sense of God promising that he's going to have a lineage, it's going to be through Isaac, and then God turned around saying, I want you to kill Isaac. Did not make any earthly sense at all. And in Romans 4, verse 19, I think helps us to see a little bit into this. In Romans 4, verse 19, he says, and not being weak in faith, talk about Abraham, not being weak in faith, he's strong, faith strong. He did not consider his own body already dead, since about 100 years old, and dead in Sarah's womb. He did not waver the promise of God through unbelief, but was strengthened in faith, giving glory to God, and being fully convinced that he had promised what he had promised he was able to perform. Before Isaac was born, Abraham, although he's 100 years old, God said it, Abraham believed it, that settled it. What's the old adage? If God says it, I believe it, and that settles it. Well, that's what Abraham was. And so when God tells Abraham, take your son and offer him up, and Abraham goes out there, and he's ready to kill him, it says in a figurative sense that he already had received him up. He raised him up. In other words, in Abraham's mind, it was such a thing that he just believed God was going to raise up Isaac, and even though he hadn't done it, it was as if it already happened. Again, that's faith. F. Bruce, in his commentary on this, He says, Abraham seemed to treat this as God's concern. It was God, not Abraham, who had to reconcile his promise and his command. In other words, Abraham said, okay, God said this. I don't understand why, but God said it, and therefore I'm going to do it. I'll let God handle the rest of it. And that's the way we have to be. There are things we do by faith that we have to trust in God, and that'll work out the way God says so. Okay, he goes on and says, how was Isaac received from the dead and figured? Hebrews 11, verse 19. And again, Hebrews 11, verse 19 says, concluding that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from which he also received him in a figurative sense. And so, like I said earlier, in Abraham's mind, Abraham was already dead. Isaac was already dead. That's how sure he was. So God says, sacrificing, okay, done. And so in Abraham's mind, Isaac had already been brought back to life. He had already been received back from the dead. That's just how sure he was in God's promises and faith in God. What is it that Isaac did by faith? Well, it goes on, and we see that Abraham has Isaac, and Isaac has Jacob and Esau. And so in Hebrews 11, verse 20, it says, by faith Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning things to come. Talking about future events. So you go in Genesis 27, verse 26. And I'm going to read down through verse 29. But said, then his father Isaac said to him, come near me now, and kiss me, my son. And he came near and kissed him. And he smelled the smell of his clothing, and blessed him, and says, surely the smell of my son is like the smell of a field which the Lord has blessed. Therefore may God give you of the dew of heaven, of the fatness of the earth, and plenty of grain and wine. Let people serve you, and nations bow down to you. Be master over your brethren. Let your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be those who bless you. And that is that, again, Isaac understood the blessing God had promised him, and he simply given that blessing to Jacob. And he also blessed Esau, becoming a great nation also. And so, again, their belief in God, although they had not received the land of promise, and they were still a small group of people, they still trusted in God. They still had faith in what God said. He blessed both of the sons of Joseph. We'll turn around and we see that Jacob does the same thing. Later on in Hebrews 11, verse 21, it says, by faith Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshiped leaning on the top of his staff. So Jacob is the answer to this. And again, he had to go back to Genesis to get the full picture of this. And so if you go back to Genesis 48, and there, verse 14, it said, then Israel, that is Jacob, stretched out his right hand and laid on Ephraim's head, who was the younger, and his left hand on Manasseh's head, guiding his hands knowingly, for Manasseh was the firstborn. And he blessed Joseph and said, God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God has fed me all my long life to this day. The angels redeemed me from all evil. Bless the lads. Let my name be named among them, and the name of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow to a multitude in the midst of the earth. And so, again, his faith in God prompted him to give a blessing to Joseph's sons, that they would be prosperous, that God would be with them. And so verse 17 goes on and said, now when Joseph saw that his father had laid his right hand on the head of Ephraim, it displeased him. So he took hold of his father's hand and removed it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. And Joseph said to his father, not so, my father, for this is one that is firstborn. Put your right hand on his head. But his father refused, said, I know, my son, I know. He also shall become a people, and he also shall be great. But truly his younger brother shall be greater than he, and the son shall become a multitude of nations. So he blessed them that day, saying, by you Israel will bless, saying, may God make you as Ephraim and Manasseh. And thus set Ephraim before Manasseh. And some of this deals with a tradition of the younger son usually gets the greater blessing. In this case, Jacob actually gave the older son usually received the blessing. In this case, Jacob actually gave the blessing to the young son. But the point is, God will bless him. And so he believed in what God said to do. Believe God. Then finally, our final question is concerning what did Joseph give command when he died? And so we have gone from Abraham, believing God, to Isaac, to Jacob, now to Joseph. And so in Hebrews 11, verse 22, it said, by faith Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the departure of the children of Israel, and gave instructions concerning his bones. And again, this goes back to Genesis. And so I'm not to go back there and read this here. But in Genesis 50, verse 24, it said, Joseph said to his brethren, I am dying, but God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land to the land of which he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Then Joseph took oath from the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and he shall carry up my bones from here. So Joseph died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. Now consider the faith of Joseph here. Joseph was basically taken from the land of Canaan when he was about 17 years of age. And at 17 years of age, he lives the rest of his life in Egypt. And here, now at this time, all of his family's done in Egypt. Joseph is kind of like second in charge in Egypt. His family is set up in the land of Goshen. And what he's talking about is that whenever my people go back to Canaan, I want you to take my bones back with you. Joseph knew that Egypt was not the settling place of his people, that God had promised the land of Canaan, and therefore he's even now, it'd be 400 years later, but even at that point he's saying, when you go back, take my body with you. That shows the faith Joseph had and what God said to do. And so that is great faith. All these people, as you think about it, the first group there of Abel, Enoch, and Noah lived before the flood. Now this point on here, what we have with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, we have the examples of those in the book of Genesis. Those after the flood, but before the law of Moses. Both groups live by faith. A thought question we have is, what are some of the ways our faith is tested to prove whether or not we are looking for a city whose builder and maker is God? Well, the thing is, what are our priorities? It's easy to get caught up in the here and now and the temporary and the physical pleasures of this life versus the eternal. Our priorities don't show which one's more important to us. Do we look forward to the city in the future, or are we trying to find everything right now? What decisions are we making? And that's going to show my faith, what's really important to me. What sacrifices am I willing to make in order to receive this heavenly city? What am I willing to give up now in order to have something greater when this life's over with? Those are the kind of things I believe they're asking for in this thought question. Well, I appreciate you watching, and I hope that, again, this has been helpful in your study of Hebrews. If you feel noteworthy, then feel free to share this, hit the like button, and maybe the others will also get to watch this and learn also. But if you have any questions, let me know. If you can, come be with us at Lilac Road. Our building is located 1687 Lilac Road, Ellisville, Kentucky. Sunday morning Bible class at 9:30, worship at 10:25, and then worship on Sunday evenings at 7 p.m. Wednesday night we have Bible classes at 7 p.m. I appreciate you watching. I hope you have a good day.